Okay, we will be reading chapter 12 today of The Mouse and the Motorcycle. When we left off yesterday on chapter 11, Ralph was shaken out of the window and he's hanging on for dear life onto some vines. So today, chapter 12 is called An Errand of Mercy. Owls, thought Ralph as he clung to the Virginia creeper. He filled his lungs with the cool night air. That was such a relief after the stuffy drinking glass. I've always wanted to climb down this vine and explore the ground floor, he reminded himself grimly. And now I have to. Ralph had never before been outside beneath the moon and the stars. He felt small and frightened and alone. Slowly, paw over paw, he worked along the shoots of the trundles. An owl, uncomfortably close in a pine tree, hooted, and Ralph huddled, shivering in the shadow of a leaf, aware that he was losing precious seconds. A night wind rattled the window, and the owl glided off across the parking lot. Ralph inched his way down the vine, along the winding route full of detours in the ground floor window, which, to Ralph's relief, was open. Upon reaching the sill, Ralph leapt to the floor of the room in which 3 young men of college age were sleeping. 2 beds and one asleep in a bag on the floor. An aspirin. I have to find an aspirin, thought Ralph. Darting under the bed, he bumped into another dust mouse, which startled him. He did not find an aspirin. He was in such a hurry that he ran right over the man in the sleeping bag instead of taking the time to go around. There, under the dresser, gleaming in the shaft of the moonlight, he saw a round white pill. He went a little closer. Yes, it really was an aspirin tablet. At last! Ralph was positive it was aspirin and not some other sort of pill because it had the letters stamped on it. Ralph could not read the letters, but he knew they stood for aspirin. He had been warned about them enough times to know. Now all Ralph had to do was figure out how to get the pill upstairs to room 215. Telling himself that in spite of all that had happened that night, it could not be much past 1 o'clock in the morning, Ralph half pushed and half rolled the aspirin tablet around the man and in the sleeping bag to the door. He shoved it under the door and with great difficulty squeezed himself under. The first floor carpet was thicker and of better quality than on the second floor. Ralph worked his way with the aspirin down the hall to the lobby where the night clerk was asleep on the couch. The glassy eyes of the deer head mounted on the knotty pine walls seemed to stare at Ralph. So did the giant eye of the television set. He slowly moved his precious load across the lobby to the stairs where he had stopped. How could he manage to get that aspirin up those stairs? He picked it up. He tried lifting it. He even thought he knew how he could reach the first step with it. The night clerk tossed on the couch and made a gobbling, snorting kind of noise. Ralph dropped the aspirin in a panic and looked wildly about for a hiding place. With one terrific leap, he dived under the grandfather clock between the elevator and the stairs. It was immediately plain from dust that no one had ever cleaned under the clock. Ha ha ha. Ralph struggled to control a sneeze. Ha ha. Above him, the works of the clock began to make grinding noises. Achoo! The sneeze not be held back. Bong! The clock struck 1:30, forcing Ralph to clap his hands over his ears. How his famous ancestors, the one that ran up the clock, Hickory Dickory Dock, stood that racket all the time. He did not know. Peeking out, Ralph discovered that night clerk had slept soundly through the ding. So he vented out from under the clock to continue his struggle with the aspirin tablet. Since carrying the pill up the stairs was impossible, Ralph had to find another way. The elevator. Ridiculous. A mouse could not run an elevator. Then, quite unexpectedly, a whole plan of action popped into his mind. Ralph had a genius inspiration. First, he rolled the aspirin to the safe place behind the ashtray. Then, empty-pawed, he climbed the stairs to the second floor, ran down to the hall to the room 215, where he squeezed under the door. Keith was still half awake. His eyes glinted in his fever under their heavy lids. Psst, said Ralph. I found an aspirin for you. Ugh, Keith murmured. An aspirin tablet? I found an aspirin tablet. Yo, where is it? Keith was more awake now. It's down on the first floor. Oh, Keith was obviously disappointed. Now wait, said Ralph. I can get it up here, but I've got to get some help. You have to let me take your sports car. No, you're too young. I am not. And it was true that Ralph was very much older than he had been when he lost the motorcycle. Come on, you need the aspirin, don't you? You already lost my motorcycle. Oh, come on. Ralph was growing more impatient as he felt the night slipping away. If you won't let me take your sports car, can I take the ambulance? Fine. Keith did not feel equal to argue with a determined little mouse. He picked up his ambulance from the bedside table and set it on the floor. Here. One more thing, said Ralph anxiously. Do you think you could manage to open the door for me? I know you feel terrible and all, but it's the last thing I'll ask for. Honest. I promise, and I'll have the aspirin here in no time. He slugged his feet out from under the bedsheets, hanging onto the bedside table, reached over and opened the door. Ralph was already seated in the white ambulance with the red cross painted on the sides. Wee, wee, wee. He took the corner into the hall, and the two wheels had sped down the bare thread carpet until he came to room 211, where he slowed down and went wee, nice and loud. This carried him on as he planned to the elevator, which was his crucial moment. Now he would find out if his plan was going to work. The little dog in room 211 began to whimper, and then the dog began to bark as Ralph had planned. In a moment, the door opened, and the man stumbled out with the little terrier in his arms. All right, he grumbled. I'll walk you. Just stop barking, will you? Ralph waited. His paws were tense on the steering wheel. The man walked groggily to the closed elevator door, where he managed, in spite of the wriggling dog in his arms, to push the button. Soon the elevator door slid open. Ralph knew that timing was important. The man entered the elevator. The dog barked. Whee! Said Ralph, hard enough and fast enough to shoot the ambulance at a great speed across the yawning crack between the floor and the hall and the elevator before the man turned around. As the dog's owner turned, Ralph steered skillfully around his feet and parked the ambulance behind him. The man pressed the button, the doors closed, and the elevator actually began to go down. Do you know what you are? The man said sheepishly to the dog. You are a nuisance. That's what you are, a four-footed, hair-covered nuisance. The dog ignored his master. I know you're down there, he yapped to Ralph. If I could just get down, I would get you. Ralph didn't answer. He was taking no chances. He waited quietly inside the ambulance until the man had carried the dog out before he drove out of the elevator. He jumped out of the ambulance, opened the rear doors, seized the precious aspirin, and boosted inside. Slamming the doors, he ran and jumped into the driver's seat. There was not a minute to lose. The ambulance moved forward into the open elevator, but unfortunately by this time Ralph was slightly out of breath. The front wheels of the ambulance caught in the crack between the floor of the lobby and the floor of the elevator. The ambulance was stuck. Oh no, not now. I can't fail now. He managed to gasp. The wheels spun. The ambulance didn't move. Ralph jumped out, put his shoulders at the rear of the vehicle. He pushed with all his strength. Nothing happened. In that moment, the man would be returning with his dog. Desperate, Ralph climbed back into the ambulance. He took a deep breath with his lungs as surely he thought they were going to burst. He made the sound hard and fast and high-pitched, and the wheels spun and spun. The ambulance moved, slowly at first, but then the tires got grip on the floor and shot across the crack and across the elevator and hit the rear wall with a boof. Ralph collapsed over the steering wheel, limp with relief, just as a man came back through the lobby with his dog. I guess boy lost his toy ambulance, muttered the man, more awake now as he stepped into and pressed the button. Toy, thought Ralph. This ambulance is carrying medical supplies to the sick. Boy, my foot, yapped the terrier. It's that dastardly mouse. Let me down and I'll get him. Ralph did not want to answer. He was saving all his breath now to get the ambulance across that crack one more time. The man slapped the dog lightly on the nose. He said, Be quiet. I took you outside, didn't I? Fortunately, the elevator door stayed open behind the man as he walked out. So Ralph had no trouble driving the ambulance out and down the hall to 215. The door had blown shut, but he didn't care. He jumped out of the ambulance and ran around to the back where he unloaded the aspirin, shoved it under the bedroom door, and squeezed it under after. Hey, Keith, I got it. Ralph was filled with triumph. I brought you an aspirin. That's the end.